The massive ships floated in the darkness of space like sleeping metal giants. Their silver hulls caught the light from distant stars and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Jiho pressed his face against the cold window of the observation deck and watched as the last group of humans walked up the loading ramps into the enormous vessels. Behind him, Captain Minsu typed final numbers into his data pad, while Dr. Sora made sure all the important things were safely stored away. Earth looked small and blue from where they were, but Jiho knew it would be empty soon. The decision had been made months ago after years of frustration and disappointment. The other species in the galaxy had grown lazy and selfish. They expected humans to fix everything, to fight their battles, to solve their problems. But they never said thank you. They never showed respect. For 50 long years, humans had been part of the Galactic Assembly. They had shared their knowledge, their technology, their blood, and their lives with species from across the stars. They had built hospitals on alien worlds. They had stopped wars before they started. They had designed the communication systems that let everyone talk to each other across impossible distances. They had created the trade routes that made everyone rich. They had been the peacekeepers, the problem solvers, the ones who never gave up. But somewhere along the way, the other species had forgotten that humans were their partners, not their servants. The proud Zenthari with their glowing blue skin had started giving orders instead of making requests. The tall Karathi with their multiple arms had begun demanding human help, as if it was their right. The floating ethereals with their see-through bodies had stopped coming to meetings where humans spoke as if human ideas were not worth hearing. Counselor Dongyun had tried to make things better. He had spent weeks talking to the leaders of Earth, trying to find a way to stay. He had argued that leaving would hurt innocent people. He had worried about the friends they would leave behind. But in the end, even he had to agree. The galaxy had made its choice, and that choice was to take humanity for granted. The loading process had taken 3 days. Every human from every world in the galaxy was coming home to join the great departure. Families carried their belongings in simple bags, knowing they might never return. Children asked their parents why they were leaving, and the parents struggled to explain in words that young minds could understand. How do you tell a child that sometimes people only realize how much you matter after you are gone? Jiho remembered the meeting where the final vote was taken. The Human Council had gathered in the Great Hall on Luna Station. The debate had lasted for hours. Some wanted to stay and fight for respect. Others wanted to give the galaxy one more chance, but Elder Hagen had stood up and spoken the words that changed everything. She had said that sometimes the best way to teach someone your value is to show them what life is like without you. Captain Minsu walked over to where Jiho stood, looking out at the stars. The captain was a practical man who had spent his life moving people and cargo safely from one place to another. He had seen the galaxy change over the decades. He had watched as human crews were slowly replaced by alien workers. He had noticed how human ideas were credited to other species. He had felt the slow shift from partnership to service. Dr. Sora joined them at the window. She carried a data pad filled with medical records and research notes that represented centuries of human medical knowledge. She had worked in alien hospitals. She had saved lives that other species had given up on. She had trained alien doctors in techniques that humans had developed. But lately her research proposals had been rejected. Her funding had been cut. Her alien colleagues had stopped asking for her advice. The three of them stood together watching the final preparations. The loading bays were closing. The engines were warming up. The navigation computers were calculating jump coordinates to places far beyond the edge of known space. Humanity had found new worlds. During their years of exploration, worlds that the other species did not know about, worlds where humans could build something new, without interference. Down in the ship, hundreds of families were finding their quarters. Children were scared but excited about the adventure. Adults were sad but determined to make a better future. The cargo holds were filled with everything humans would need to start over: seeds and animals, tools and machines, books and art. Everything that made humanity special was packed away, ready for the journey. The communication systems crackled to life. Captain Minsu received the final reports from all the other ships in the fleet. Every human settlement had been evacuated. Every research station had been shut down. Every military base had been abandoned. The humans were leaving nothing behind except empty buildings and the memories of what they had contributed. In the assembly chambers on Nexus Prime, alien representatives were beginning to notice the empty seats, where human delegates usually sat. Some assumed the humans were busy with some crisis somewhere, as they always were. Others thought maybe it was just a scheduling problem. None of them imagined that humanity was preparing to disappear entirely. Ambassador Heejin sat alone in her office on Nexus Prime. She was the last human diplomat in assembly space. Her job was to deliver the message that would explain everything she had written and rewritten the words dozens of times, trying to find the right way to say goodbye. The message was simple, but its meaning was enormous. Humanity was leaving not in anger, but in disappointment. They were leaving because they had given everything and received nothing in return. The departure signal flashed across. All the ship's engines roared to life with power that could move mountains. Drive systems engaged with energy that could light up stars. Navigation computers locked onto coordinates that pointed toward empty space beyond the galactic rim. One by one, the massive vessels began to move away from Earth, away from the worlds they had called home, away from the species they had tried to help. Jiho felt the ship accelerate and watched as Earth grew smaller in the window. Soon it was just another point of light among billions of stars. The fleet moved together like a school of metal fish swimming through an ocean of darkness. They jumped into hyperspace in perfect formation, leaving behind only empty space and silent radio frequencies. The hours that followed, alien communication networks carried confused messages. Why were human colonies not responding? Why were human ships not answering calls? Why had human representatives not shown up for scheduled meetings? The questions multiplied as species across the galaxy realized that something was very wrong. The Vexari Empire monitoring stations detected the massive energy signatures of the human fleet departure. Their war chiefs smiled, thinking that humanity was retreating in fear, but they did not understand that humans were not running away from a fight. They were walking away from people who had forgotten their worth. And sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. The great human exodus was complete. The galaxy would soon learn what it meant to live without the species that had quietly become the foundation of everything they took for granted. 3 months had passed since humanity vanished from the galaxy, and the silence where their voices used to be was growing louder every day. General Yanwu stood on the bridge of the human flagship, watching distant star systems through advanced sensors that no other species knew how to build. The ship floated in the empty space between galaxies where humanity had built secret bases during their years of exploration. The reports coming from their old home were not good. The Vexari Empire had been waiting for this moment for decades. Their biomechanical ships looked like living creatures made of metal and flesh, with hulls that could heal themselves and weapons that adapted to whatever they fought. For years, the only thing that had stopped them from attacking was the human military presence in the border regions. Now that presence was gone, and the Vexari were moving. Commander Kyung-soo piloted his scout ship along the edge of assembly space, watching the invasion unfold through stealth systems that made his vessel invisible to enemy sensors. The Vexari fleet was massive, hundreds of ships that looked like giant insects swimming through the void. Their biohulls pulsed with sickly green light, and their weapon ports opened and closed like breathing mouths. The first system to fall was Kepler Station, a mining colony that the Assembly had always considered safe. It was protected by Xanthari defense platforms and Karathi patrol ships that should have been able to hold off any attack. But the Vexari bioweapons ate through their shields like acid through paper. The defense platforms melted and the patrol ships were destroyed so quickly that they barely had time to send distress calls. Kyung-soo watched from a safe distance as the biomechanical ships landed on the mining world like metal locusts. The Vexari ground forces looked like nightmares, made real, part machine, part living creature, all hunger and violence. They consumed everything useful and left behind only empty husks where cities used to be. The few survivors who escaped told stories that made hardened soldiers wake up screaming. Back in assembly space, the emergency meetings had started, but they were going nowhere. The Xanthari Council kept demanding to know where the human military was. The Karathi hegemony insisted that human starships should be responding to their calls for help. The ethereal collective floated in their chambers, sending confused telepathic messages asking why human thoughts were no longer part of the galactic mind ambassador. Hijin sat alone in her empty office on Nexus Prime, reading message after message from species that had barely acknowledged her existence just months before. The same aliens, who had dismissed human military tactics as too violent and unpredictable, were now begging for those exact tactics to save them. The same leaders who had called human weapons crude and primitive were crying for human firepower to stop the Vexari. Advanced Dr. Sora analyzed the intercepted communications from her position aboard the human research vessel. The data painted a picture of complete confusion among the assembly forces. Without human tactical coordinators, the different species could not work together effectively. The Zenthari wanted to fight in formation, but the Karathi preferred hit-and-run attacks. The Ethereals tried to use telepathic warfare, but the Vexari biominds were immune to mental influence. Each species was fighting the war they knew how to fight, but none of them knew how to fight the war that needed to be fought. The humans had always been the ones who figured out new tactics, who adapted to new enemies, who found ways to turn disadvantages into victories. But humans fought dirty when they had to, and the other species had always looked down on that. Now they were learning why dirty fighting sometimes kept you alive. The second system to fall was New Harmony, a peaceful world where different species had lived together for generations. The Karathi defenders tried to use their advanced navigation skills to outmaneuver the Vexari ships, but biomechanical vessels could change direction in ways that normal physics should not allow. The ethereal peacekeepers attempted to negotiate with the invaders, but you cannot reason with creatures that see everything as either food or fuel. General Yanwu received detailed reports from human agents who had stayed behind to watch the same assembly. Leaders who had questioned human military spending were now throwing everything they had at the Vexari, and it was not enough. Their fleets were designed for peacekeeping, not real war. Their weapons were made to disable, not destroy their tactics. Assumed enemies who would follow the same rules they did, but the Vexari followed no rules except survival of the strongest. Their ships grew stronger by consuming the wreckage of defeated enemies. Their weapons evolved with each battle, learning to counter whatever defenses they faced. Their ground troops could adapt to any environment by literally eating it and making it part of themselves. Commander Kyung-Soo watched the third battle from behind a small moon, his ship hidden by human stealth, technology that the assembly had never been allowed to study. The Zenthari had gathered their most powerful fleet to make a stand at the binary systems where twin stars provided energy for massive orbital factories. The battle should have been a victory for the defenders who outnumbered the attackers 3-1, but numbers meant nothing when coordination failed. The Zenthari ships were beautiful and fast, but they fought like individuals, not like a team. The Karathi reinforcements arrived, too late, because they had spent too much time planning the perfect approach. The ethereal support vessels hung back, trying to maintain telepathic contact with allies instead of jamming enemy communications. The Vexari bioships moved like a single organism, each vessel supporting the others in ways that seemed to violate tactical doctrine. They accepted losses that would have terrified normal commanders, because their ships could literally grow back from pieces. They targeted enemy commanders, first disrupting the chain of command that held the defense together. In less than 6 hours, the entire system was in Vexari hands. The orbital factories that had taken decades to build were being consumed and converted into more bioships. The refugees who escaped carried tales of horror that spread through assembly space like a disease. Dr. Sora compiled the casualty reports from the 3 lost systems. The numbers were staggering, not just in lives lost, but in infrastructure destroyed. Each system that fell made the assembly weaker while making the Vexari stronger. The invaders were not just conquering territory, they were consuming it, making it part of their growing war machine. Ambassador Hijin received a priority message from the Zenthari, High Command offering humanity partnership terms that would have been unthinkable months before: complete military autonomy, unlimited resources, full authority over assembly defense planning. But the message was sent to empty space, where human colonies used to be. Humanity was not coming back to save ungrateful neighbors who only remembered their worth when crisis struck. The first phase of the Vexari invasion was complete, and the galaxy was beginning to understand what it had lost when it let humanity walk away. 6 months after humanity disappeared from the galaxy, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Captain Minsu floated in his command chair aboard the human flagship, reading reports that painted a picture of total collapse. The Vexari Empire was winning their war. But that was just the beginning of the galaxy's problems. Everything that the other species had taken for granted was falling apart without human hands to maintain it. The first sign of deeper trouble came from the trade routes. The massive cargo ships that carried goods between star systems were running out of fuel and spare parts because the supply stations had been built and maintained by human engineers. The Karathi were master navigators, but they had never learned how to repair the quantum drives that made long-distance travel possible. The Zenthari could fly their ships perfectly, but they could not fix the life support systems when they broke down. Elder Hagen stood in the observation lounge of the colony, ship-watching stars that no other species had ever seen. Humans had been exploring beyond the galactic rim for decades, finding new worlds and building secret outposts in case they ever needed to start over. The reports from their old home confirmed that the decision to leave had been wise, but also showed how much damage their absence was causing. Intelligence Officer Jiwan had managed to place monitoring devices throughout assembly space before humanity left. Now those devices were sending back data that revealed the full extent of the crisis. The quantum communication network that allowed instant messages across the galaxy was failing without human technicians to maintain the relay stations. Each failed node left entire sectors, cut off from the rest of civilization. Dr. Sora analyzed the technical reports from her laboratory ship. The other species had always assumed that maintaining galactic infrastructure was simple routine work that anyone could do. But human engineers had been quietly solving thousands of small problems every day. Problems that seemed minor until they were not being fixed anymore. A broken atmospheric processor here, a failing gravity generator there, worn-out fusion reactors that needed replacement, parts that only humans knew how to make. The medical crisis was even worse. Human doctors and nurses had staffed hospitals on dozens of worlds, not just because they were skilled, but because they never gave up on patients that other species considered. Hopeless human medical research had created treatments for diseases that affected multiple species. But the alien doctors who used those treatments had never learned the underlying science. Commander Kyung-soo piloted his scout ship through the ruins of what used to be a thriving star system. The Vexari had moved on to other targets, but they had left behind worlds that were slowly dying, without the infrastructure to support life. The atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable had been designed by humans and required human knowledge to repair. The water purification systems were failing, because replacement parts were manufactured in human facilities that no longer existed. But the technical failures were nothing compared to the social collapse. The Galactic Assembly had been more than just a political organization. It had been a carefully balanced system that required constant attention to prevent old conflicts from reigniting. Human diplomats had spent decades building trust between species that had warred with each other for centuries. Human peacekeepers had stopped fights before they could become wars. Human mediators had found compromises that let everyone save face without humans to smooth over disagreements. The assembly was tearing itself apart. The Zenthari blamed the Karathi for not doing enough to stop the Vexari invasion. The Karathi accused the Ethereals of abandoning the defense effort. The Ethereals claimed that everyone else was too violent and refused to consider peaceful solutions that might end the war. Ambassador Heejin watched the emergency sessions from her empty office, as species representatives shouted at each other in languages that their universal translators could barely handle. The translation system itself was another human innovation that required constant updates and maintenance to handle the subtle meanings that could start or prevent wars. Without human linguists to update the database's simple misunderstandings were becoming major diplomatic incidents. The economic system was collapsing as well. The interstellar banking network that had made trade possible across thousands of light years had been designed by human economists who understood how to balance the needs of very different species. The alien bankers who had taken over were making decisions based on their own species, priorities causing currency crashes and trade wars. Dr. Sora received reports from human sleeper agents still embedded in alien societies. The agents had been left behind to observe and report, but they were forbidden from intervening even when they saw problems they could easily fix. The reports painted a picture of civilizations that had become dependent on human innovation, without realizing it. The thermal regulators that maintained perfect climates on dozens of worlds were shutting down one by one because their biomechanical components required human understanding of both technology and biology to maintain the gravity wells that made it possible to land safely on high-gravity worlds were losing calibration because the calculations required human intuition about how different species experienced gravitational forces. Food production was failing as agricultural systems designed by human scientists broke down without proper maintenance. The other species had learned to use human farming techniques, but they had never understood the science behind them. When crop diseases appeared that the standard treatments could not handle, there were no human researchers to develop new solutions. Commander Kyung-soo intercepted communications between fleeing refugee ships. Species that had been proud members of the assembly just months before were now scattered groups of survivors looking for any safe harbor. The same aliens who had once questioned human authority were begging any ship they encountered to take them to human space. But human space no longer existed in the galaxy. They knew. The most devastating revelation came from the military analysis intelligence officer Ji-won had discovered that the Vexari invasion had been planned for years, but the timing was not coincidental. The biomechanical empire had been waiting for humanity to leave because they knew that humans were the only species that could adapt quickly enough to counter their evolving weapons and tactics. Captain Min-soo read the final intelligence reports that confirmed what many humans had suspected. The other species had not just taken human contributions for granted. They had actively worked to reduce human influence in the assembly. They had voted down human proposals, cut human funding, and excluded humans from important decisions, all while depending on human expertise to keep their civilization running. Elder Hagen called a meeting of the Human Colonial Council to discuss the situation. The reports from their former home were heartbreaking, but they also proved that humanity had made the right choice. The galaxy had chosen to treat humans as servants rather than partners, and now it was learning the price of that decision. The question now was whether humanity should care about the consequences of choices they had not made. 1 year after humanity vanished from the galaxy, the Galactic Assembly held its final meeting. The Great Hall on Nexus Prime that had once hosted thousands of representatives from hundreds of species now held only a few dozen survivors. The proud banners of member worlds hung in tatters, and the holographic displays that had shown a united galaxy flickered with static as the quantum communication network continued to fail. Elder Hagen watched the proceedings through intercepted transmissions from her flagship deep in the void between galaxies. The human colonial fleet had grown larger during their exile, as refugees from their own scattered colonies joined the Exodus ships that had been exploring the far reaches of space returned home, bringing news of worlds that no other species knew existed. The Zenthari delegate spoke first, his glowing blue skin now dim with exhaustion and despair. The proud warriors who had once dismissed human military tactics as crude had lost their entire home fleet to the Vexari biomechanical swarms. Their remaining ships were scattered across the galaxy, protecting refugee convoys that grew smaller with each attack. Their ancient honor codes meant nothing against enemies that fought without rules. The Karathi representative stood on 4 of her 6 arms, the other 2 hanging useless from injuries received in the evacuation of her species' capital world. The master navigators had discovered that knowing where to go meant nothing if you did not have the ships to get there. The trade routes they had maintained for centuries were now death traps haunted by Vexari hunter packs that grew stronger with each ship they consumed. Captain Min-soo received reports from human reconnaissance teams that painted a picture of total civilizational collapse. The ethereal collective had retreated into their crystalline cities and refused all contact with the physical world. The floating beings had always claimed to exist on a higher plane than other species, but their telepathic networks were useless against biomechanical minds that did not think in ways they could understand. Dr. Sora studied the medical reports that showed the true cost of the galactic war. Plagues were spreading through refugee populations because the medical facilities that could have treated them had been destroyed or abandoned. The sophisticated treatments that human doctors had developed were useless without the knowledge to apply them correctly. Alien physicians were watching patients die from diseases that should have been easily curable. The Vexari Empire had achieved something that no conqueror in galactic history had managed. They had not just defeated their enemies, they had broken the spirit of an entire civilization. The biomechanical fleets consumed everything they conquered, turning planets into hatcheries for more ships, turning populations into raw material for their growing war machine. But even the Vexari were discovering that conquest was easier than administration. The infrastructure they had captured was failing without the knowledge to maintain it. The beautiful cities they had taken were becoming ruins, as systems designed by human engineers shut down one by one. The biomechanical ships that had seemed invincible were beginning to malfunction as they tried to replicate technologies they did not understand. Commander Kyung-soo piloted his stealth ship through what had once been the Karathi home system. The planets that had hosted billions of beings were now empty except for the hulks of dead ships and the twisted remains of cities. The Vexari had moved on to easier targets, leaving behind worlds that could no longer support life without the infrastructure that humans had built. Intelligence Officer Ji-won compiled the final reports on the collapse of galactic civilization. The economic networks had completely failed as currencies became worthless and trade ground to a halt. The agricultural systems that had fed trillions were producing nothing but poisoned soil. The energy grids that had powered entire star systems were going dark, one reactor at a time. Ambassador Heejin sat in her empty office reading the desperate messages that arrived daily from the few surviving governments. Each message offered humanity more than the last: complete autonomy over entire sectors, unlimited resources, absolute authority over all military and civilian operations. But the messages were sent to addresses that no longer existed to people who were no longer listening. The most tragic reports came from the worlds where different species had lived together in harmony. Communities that had taken generations to build were tearing themselves apart, as fear and desperation drove neighbors to turn against each other. The careful balance that human diplomats had maintained was gone, and old hatreds were surfacing with deadly results. Dr. Sora analyzed the psychological profiles of the survivors. The species that were adapting best to the collapse were those that had worked closest with humans during the years of cooperation. They had learned human flexibility, human stubbornness, human refusal to accept defeat even when everything seemed hopeless. The proud species that had kept their distance from humans were the ones suffering the most. The Vexari Empire was discovering its own limitations. The biomechanical fleets that had conquered so easily were now struggling to maintain their victories. The adaptive weapons that had overcome every defense were failing against problems that required innovation rather than evolution. The living ships that could heal from any wound could not repair damage to systems they had never learned to understand. Captain Minsu received the final transmission from Nexus Prime. The Galactic Assembly was officially dissolved. The great experiment in interspecies cooperation that had lasted for centuries was ending, not with a vote or a treaty, but with the simple reality that there was no longer a galaxy to govern. Most of the member species were extinct, scattered, or reduced to primitive survival. Elder Hyegen called a meeting of the Human Colonial Council to discuss what they had learned. The reports from their former home confirmed what many had suspected. The galaxy had not just lost a member species when humanity left. They had lost the foundation that held everything together. Humans had been the mediators, the innovators, the ones who found solutions, when others saw only problems. The question now was whether humanity should return to help rebuild or let the galaxy learn to survive without them. The decision would shape the future of an entire galaxy and determine whether the lessons of the collapse had been learned or if the same mistakes would be repeated in the ruins of Nexus Prime. Ambassador Heejin powered down her office for the last time. The great hall that had once hosted the dreams of a united galaxy stood empty except for The ghosts of what might have been the galaxy had made its choice, and now it would live with the consequences. The age of the Galactic Assembly was over, and no one knew what would come next. 2 years after humanity disappeared from the galaxy, they came back, but not as the same people who had left. The fleet that emerged from the void between galaxies was 3 times larger than the one that had departed. The ships were sleek and powerful, built with technologies that no other species had ever imagined. The humans had used their exile, well turning their anger and disappointment into determination and innovation. Elder Heijin stood on the bridge of the flagship watching as the human fleet moved through space like a silver river flowing toward their old home. The years in the void had changed them all. The children who had left as refugees were now young adults who had never known defeat. The adults who had left in sadness were now leaders who understood their own worth. The elderly who had left in disappointment were now teachers who would make sure the lessons were never forgotten. Captain Minsu commanded the lead battle group as they entered the ruins of what had once been assembly space. The Vexari Empire still controlled large sections of the galaxy, but their biomechanical ships were struggling to maintain systems they had never learned to understand. The adaptive weapons that had made them unstoppable were failing against infrastructure problems that required creativity, not evolution. The first contact came when a Vexari hunter pack detected the human fleet and moved to attack. Commander Kyung-soo watched from his scout ship as the biomechanical vessels approached with the same confidence that had conquered the galaxy. But these were not the same humans they remembered. These humans had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. The battle lasted less than an hour. The human ships moved with precision that made the Vexari biomechanical coordination look clumsy by comparison. Weapons that had evolved to counter every known defense were useless against technologies that had never existed before. The hunter pack that had destroyed entire fleets was reduced to drifting wreckage before they could adapt to what they were facing. Dr. Sora analyzed the wreckage from her research vessel. The Vexari biotechnology was impressive, but it was limited by its own nature. It could only evolve along paths that biological systems could follow. Human technology had no such restrictions. Humans could imagine solutions that violated the rules of nature and then build machines to make those solutions real. The news of humanity's return spread through the galaxy faster than light. The surviving species leaders who had spent 2 years hiding in refugee camps suddenly found hope they had thought was lost forever. The Zenthari who had watched their proud fleets destroyed began planning for revenge. The Karathi who had seen their trade routes turned into graveyards started dreaming of rebuilding. But the humans who returned were not the same ones who had left. Ambassador Heijin received the first diplomatic contact from the survivors, and the message was clear. Humanity would not simply return to their old role. They had learned their worth during the years of exile. They had seen what the galaxy looked like without them. They would not be taken for granted again. Elder Heijin called for a meeting on neutral ground. A small world that had somehow survived the Vexari conquest. Representatives from every surviving species gathered in a simple building that had been hastily constructed for the occasion. The grand halls and elaborate ceremonies of the old assembly were gone, replaced by the practical reality of survival. The human delegation was small, but their presence filled the room. Elder Heijin spoke first. Her words carried by translation systems that the humans had rebuilt and improved during their exile. She explained that humanity had not returned out of mercy or nostalgia. They had returned because the galaxy needed to be rebuilt, and humanity was the only species that knew how to do it, but the terms would be different. This time, humanity would not be junior partners or convenient servants. They would be acknowledged as the founders and protectors of whatever new civilization emerged from the ashes of the old. Their contributions would be recognized, their sacrifices would be honored. Their voice would be heard and respected. Captain Minsu presented the military terms. The human fleet would take charge of removing the Vexari threat, but they would do it their way without interference or second-guessing from species that had proven they did not understand warfare. Human commanders would have absolute authority over all military operations. Human tactics would be followed without question. Human equipment would be used without complaint. Dr. Sora outlined the reconstruction requirements. Human engineers would rebuild the infrastructure, but they would build it to human specifications. Human doctors would treat the sick and wounded, but they would train replacements who understood human medical science. Human technicians would maintain the systems, but they would be respected as the skilled professionals they were. The surviving species listened in silence as the humans laid out their conditions. Some of the older representatives remembered the arrogance that had led to humanity's departure. They had learned humility in the years of suffering that followed. Others were younger leaders who had grown up during the collapse. They understood that cooperation meant recognizing everyone, contributions, not just taking. What you needed, Intelligence Officer Jiwan presented the evidence of what the galaxy had lost during humanity's absence. The technical failures, the social breakdown, the economic collapse, the military defeats. Every problem could be traced back to the loss of human expertise and human leadership. The galaxy had conducted a terrible experiment in pride, and the results spoke for themselves. The Vexari Empire made one final attempt to stop the human return. A massive biomechanical fleet emerged from the galactic core where they had been building new ships from the resources of conquered worlds. The fleet was larger than anything they had fielded before, adapted specifically to counter human tactics from their previous encounters. But the humans had been preparing for this moment. Commander Kyungsu led the vanguard that met the Vexari fleet in the space between star systems. The battle was not close. Human ships moved like they were dancing around enemies that seemed slow and clumsy. By comparison, weapons that could adapt to any defense were useless against attacks that changed faster than biology could follow. The Vexari Empire fell in a single day, not because humans were more violent than they were, but because humans fought with something the biomechanical creatures could never understand. Humans fought for people who mattered to them, for ideas that were bigger than themselves, for a future that was worth building. In the months that followed, the galaxy began to heal. The new galactic compact that emerged was different from the old assembly. Humanity was not just a member, but the acknowledged leader of a civilization that had learned to value what it had almost lost. The other species had learned humility, but, more importantly, they had learned gratitude. Elder Hagen stood once again on an observation deck watching ships move through space. But now they were moving with purpose toward a future that would be built on respect rather than assumption. The galaxy had learned its lesson and humanity had learned theirs. Together they would build something better than what had been lost.